Hi folks, we are going to talk about Prepress today. So in this presentation, we are going to cover a number of things. First off, we'll talk about what is Prepress. We'll then jump into the different types of artwork that we as graphic artists utilize. Talk about the foundation of halftones and what we need to know to be able to understand them so that when we incorporate it into the process, there's some things that we can address as we go through the workflow. We're going to talk kind of the basics of color reproduction. How is color reproduced through the flexography process, and also some common compensations that are used in the prepress stage of flexography. So let's jump into this. So what is prepress? So prepress is kind of like an umbrella term for just about anything digital in the workflow. So you can think about this as it could be the design stage. It could be laying art out to a template, creating a template, adding compensations for printing. It could even be like complete reproduction of a recreation of the design. What is a very common thing that occurs is that some designers or production artists, they don't really understand the technical necessities of the print workflow. So it's not uncommon to have to take a design and literally redraw it and rebuild it from scratch. I mean, in the end, it looks the exact same, or it looks exactly how the designer intended, but it's let's just say it's gone and cleaned up thoroughly and done in a correct way that will work. It also could include manipulating the plate process. A lot of times that has to do with how tones and colors are reproduced on press. So it's a lot of things that that go into the quality of how something is produced. If you don't have a good prepress artist that is working in your company, it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to have a very high quality product that comes off your press. The quality of a printed product really begins at the prepress stage. So you can kind of think of them as they're the people that ensure quality throughout the process. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of artwork that we deal with. One of them is vector artwork, and for our first project in this class, we're just using vector art for that project, and there's good reason for it. First off, it's pretty hard to mess up, and you don't really have to have a really strong technical background to be able to use vector artwork. So it's a great place to start. So this artwork is defined by shapes, lines, and anchor points. So we look at this shape. It's just a basic circle, right? Well, the thing about it is that in a vector artwork, there are anchor points that go around any shape, and those anchor points are documented by the graphic application. So the location of each of those anchor points is referenced. Then what is done is the computer documents how the lines that go between the anchor points, if they curve or if they're straight, and just documents them. And then it also will document the colors that are associated with that shape. And really everything in a vector drawing is based off of a shape. So it's pretty easy, or at least to get started in it. The nice thing about vector artwork is that it's always very crisp, clean, and sharp. The lines on it are always very, very sharp, and that's one of the main selling points of this type of artwork. The nice thing about it too is that it's fully scalable without any loss of quality. So you could design something that's itty tiny, little tiny, and then scale it all the way up to billboard size, and there'd be no loss of quality. So there's a lot of what this winds up giving a designer or a prepress artist, the power that it gives it is that, if you create something this way, it can be used in a wide variety of different methods. So the most common applications are going to be, Adobe Illustrator by far is the ringleader. Adobe just kind of dominates the whole graphics universe. But then there's also Corel Draw, which is a great alternative. It's a great alternative. It's less expensive than Illustrator, and I personally have never spent a lot of time in Corel Draw, but I've heard very, very good things about it, and some people very much so prefer it over Illustrator. All right, so what is vector art used for? Well, it's used for logos, types, and illustration. So type, for example, it always needs to be very sharp. If it's not sharp, it's not going to be legible. So type is perfect for vector artwork. Logos have to be scaled constantly so it makes sense. And illustrations, when they're reproduced, they look very, sharp and crisp and clean. So the thing to understand is that photographs really can't be vector. First off, there's no camera that captures in vector format. I wish there was. It'd be awesome if there was, but there isn't. This particular camera right here, is an extremely well done vector drawing. It's really, and this was done by a master graphic artist. And I think I read that they spent like hundreds of hours drawing this camera. And what you can see right here is that this is a representation of all of the shapes that make up this image. So while it looks very nice, it still doesn't look like a photograph. So think of it that way. Now, the other type of artwork out there is called raster artwork. Sometimes it's referred to as bitmapped. And basically, what this is that it is an image that's made from tiny squares on a grid. So if we look at this particular circle, you can see that now this is a very low resolution, or it's a very low quality image. And I did that on purpose so that we could really see how this is formed. It's all of it is just little tiny squares that hold color information. And those tiny squares are called pixels. Pixel is short for a picture element. So, and really all it can do, all a pixel is just a square that holds color information. It's it can be one of 16.7 million different colors. Actually, it can be more than that, but that's usually the number of colors that a pixel can be, one of those. Quite a few, it sounds like, right? So another term to kind of understand in reference to raster artwork is the idea of resolution. So resolution is the number of pixels on that grid. How many are packed into a square inch? And that's usually referred to as pixels per inch, PPI, which is a term you've probably heard of before. Now, the thing to understand about resolution is that it has a direct impact on the quality of the final printed piece. So if you want something that looks really nice and prints the way it should and looks good and sharp and clean, well, you're going to need at minimum 300 PPI, and that's kind of a standard. It's been a standard for a very long time of what's print quality is 300 PPI. There are instances where it actually may need to be considerably higher than that. But generally speaking, in most instances, if you have a piece of art that is 300 PPI, it's going to reproduce nicely when we print it. Now, also the thing to understand is that a lot of images are not 300 PPI. They're not, because they don't have to be. And what that essentially means is on screen, the way that a monitor or a TV or even a cell phone reproduces images, the way that it works, it doesn't need the same level of resolution that we need whenever it's printed. So, with screen quality, it's usually about 72 PPI. it can actually vary. Like things on the internet, it's actually shifted a little bit higher these days. Sometimes it's like 96 ppi. But that's something to understand, is that if you find an image that's online, most likely it's going to be a low resolution screen quality image. So it probably is not, print level quality. So keep that in mind. So when we use raster images, it's mainly used for photographic images. Usually, it doesn't have to be. I mean, like for example, this like the example right here. This is obviously not a photograph. It is a logo, but it usually is used for photographing. That's where it's most useful. The thing is like when I look at this particular design right here, it actually would be a whole lot smarter to have it in. It'd be much smarter to have it in a vector format. The thing is that vector formats don't work online. So you might start with a vector format and then convert it to raster so that it can be used online. So even if you see a piece of artwork like this one, this logo, that really should be vector, well, the chances are is that it actually started as vector and then was converted to raster so that it could be used online. So another dreadfully important thing to understand is that if you don't start with a high resolution, you can't go and add pixels. You can't just like pull pixels out of thin air. It's like that just doesn't happen. You can go and throw more pixels at it, but it's not going to improve the quality. It's not going to improve the sharpness of the lines. So that's something to really understand, that whenever you're using raster art, you really need to start off with a very high quality image. You can always throw pixels away, and that's fine. You can reduce the quality, and that's fine if you need to do that, for a different kind of use. But the best thing to do is to start with a very high resolution capture or creation of an image, and then knock it back as needed, because you can always go down in quality, but you cannot go up. The other thing to keep in mind too is that when you scale something that's raster, you're essentially throwing away pixels. All right, so if you scale something larger, it's going to lose quality, because essentially those pixels that were this big all of a sudden now get this big. Okay. And that's where that loss of quality occurs. So something very important to understand. I've seen a number of students that go and have created some beautiful artwork in Adobe Photoshop, and then realize that they spent all this time working on something that was a low resolution and really wasn't useful for anything other than posting on social media or a website. So that's a quick little breakdown of raster artwork. So when we look at these two, the thing is you got to think about, they each have their own purpose, like tools in a toolbox. You wouldn't go use a screwdriver to go nail in a nail. You're going to use a hammer. So you got to kind of think about these two types of arts, and think about, where are they useful? So a file can definitely contain both forms of this art, and actually usually do. If you're using Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop, both of those applications can handle some aspects of vector and raster within the same file. Like for example, in Photoshop, it's mainly raster, but if you go and you make type in there, well, that type is vector. And you can take that and then you go drop it into an Adobe Illustrator file, and then go finish out the layout. So the thing to kind of think about is that if you're using Photoshop, Photoshop is usually to prepare images. It's not really for layout. It's not a layout program whatsoever. It's for adjusting tones and colors, maybe doing some manipulation of some sort, and then you take that raster image from Photoshop and you drop it into another application like Illustrator, or actually maybe InDesign, and create that layout within that vector-based program. And what that allows you to do is then complete your layout, add your text, add your logos, add some compensations, and then you would move the process forward from Adobe Illustrator. In fact, Photoshop really doesn't even allow like much, let's just say, high-end output directly from Photoshop. You have to put it into Illustrator to be able to do a lot of the things that we need to do as printers in order to make that layout work. So the thing is like, you're going to utilize both of these types of art, and they're not separate. We work with them together. Okay. So moving along, let's talk about halftones. All right. So a halftone, just it's not raster, it's not vector, it could be either. But what you really need to understand about what a halftone is, it's how tones are reproduced in the print process. So essentially, halftones are, oh, there's a little typo. It says tiny squares. It's actually not squares. It's actually usually circles, tiny circles or dots that vary in size, that blend with the color of the substrate to create the illusion of shades and tones. So when we look at this gradation on screen, we see it go from black to gray and all the way down. A continuous tone like this, when we look at it on screen, it usually contains 256 different shades of gray. There's 256 different, grays within that within that gradation. So, but the thing is like when we go to a printing press or even a digital printer, we can't go and put 256 different inks into that machine. That's impossible. So what we'd have to do is we have to kind of simulate those tones, and we do that using halftones. So when it's printed, what you see is that we have these dots that grow and shrink in size that reproduce these tones. And when viewed at a distance, it creates an illusion that blends with the color of whatever it's being printed onto, and that simulates in our mind what those shades and tones are. So if you go and you pick up a printed sample of some sort and you look at it with a magnifier, you're going to see these halftone dots. So there's a lot of uses for halftones. I mean, first off, it's for photographs. I mean, photographs have to be reproduced this way. I mean, there's, we already mentioned that, photographs, we already mentioned that photographs are usually raster, and raster images very, very, very commonly are reproduced with halftones. But it's not just photographs. It could be, images or graphics of some sort. It also is for gradients, tints, and vignettes. So those are three terms that we should maybe just go ahead and address. So a gradient is just, when one color transitions to another. There's halftone, so it starts out as a solid over here, and then this red would, gradate out. Those dots would get smaller and smaller until they go into nothing. While we have green doing the exact opposite. Over on this side, it's a solid, and then it gradiates down to nothing, and then they overlap each other. So that's a gradient. We also have a vignette, and a vignette is very similar to a gradient, but the difference is that it gradiates down to nothing or down to the substrate instead of to another color. While that seems like a very small distinction between the two, the thing is like when you gradiate down to nothing, it causes some issues in the printing process that you have to address. Okay, and that's why I distinguish the two. It's just so that we understand that this is a little bit harder to reproduce. And then another common way of doing it is what's just called a tint. And a tint is just one solid tone over an area. And this is really good, especially if like you want to use one color, but you want to have, like for example, if you wanted to have, you're printing a red plate that had red solids, but you also want to have some pink elements to it. You could simulate that pink by using tints. So, it sounds pretty simple. I mean, really, photographs and these three things. I mean, that's really what halftones are used for. But these things are very, very commonly used. Another thing just to point out is that this can be, again, vector or raster. So this plays a part regardless of the form of artwork that we're using. So when we think about halftones, when we talk about them, they're usually described in percentages. So, and that percentage is literally an area of coverage. How much area is being covered by dots? So when we look at these tone scales right here, what we see is like, if it's a very, very light tone, very, very light gray, we might say that's about 10%. And what that directly correlates to is like 10% of this area is being covered by black dot. And that's going to simulate a very light gray. And then as those dots grow in size, they cover more area and then simulate a much darker color. So that's what they are. Pretty simple to understand. So if you hear me say things like, a 50% dot or 30% coverage, this is really what I'm talking about. Like how much area is going to be covered by dots. So when we look at a photographic image and that has been output to a halftone, is that there's generally three areas of an image that we'll look at. We have the highlight areas, which is going to be the brightest areas of the image, and those are going to be represented by the smallest dots. And generally this area coverage is about 1 to 25%. Then you're going to have your midtones, and your midtones, exactly what it sounds like. It's those tones right in the middle. They're going to be middle-sized dots. About half the area is going to be covered by dot, or half the the color of the substrate will be showing through. And then, of course, the darkest areas would be your shadows. And that's where the dots get the biggest, and can even converge all the way to 100% of coverage. So when we talk about that, whenever we talk about an image, we might say like, well, the midtones look a little dark. Let's go lighten them up, or something to that effect. But this is how we communicate about the parts of an image. So another thing to understand about halftones is what we call screen ruling, line screen, or LPI. This is one term that really frustrates me because it's not a standardized term. Like if you go from, even if you go from like Photoshop to Illustrator, they don't even get the terms the exact same. So basically it's any combination of screen, rule, ruling, or line. If you get any combination of those words, this is what it's referring to. Is that it simply breaks down to lines per inch. And this means the number of lines of dots in an inch that makes up a halftone. So, so if you think about this, if you're using something that's like a higher LPI number, say like 200 lines per inch, the dots in general are going to be much smaller because there's going to be more dots and they're going to be packed into a smaller area. And since there's in a smaller area, they're essentially just going to be smaller. Now what this does is it adds more detail, but it also kind of adds a potential for error. So once those dots get very, very small and you start trying to like pull out the highest level of detail you can, it actually can have an inverse effect and you can start having problems. And now on the flip side of the coin, if If you use lower LPIs, you're going to have larger dots. This leads to less detail, but it's usually easier to reproduce and has less potential for error. So just the thing to keep in mind is that more dots equals more problems. So the kind of takeaway from this is to find out, what does your process do very well? Does it hold 150 LPI really well? If it does, then go for it. Is 100 LPI? Is that something that that looks good? Does it look good when it's printed off your machine? Well, if it looks good, then why push for more detail? The thing is like, what we want to do is that we want to have a very consistent and repeatable process every time we go through something. So you don't want to introduce error by trying to pull extra detail out of something. So the thing to keep in mind is it look good? Is it acceptable to the client? Is it reproducible? Well, let's stick with that and not try to push beyond it and whatnot. So think about that. All right. So the thing is too, what we need to understand is that all of those lines of dots, those lines of dots are on an angle, and this is really important. We don't want multiple colors to be all on the same angle. If they're all on the same angle, essentially, they'll just lay right on top of each other. So that doesn't really look very good. It just leads to, it's not very good, reproduction of color. It winds up just kind of looking black, or it looks real dark if you do it that way, and there's a lot of muted colors in it. So you want to offset them by particular amounts. Now right here, these are just some very generic default angles that are used for the different colors. Generally what you want to do is you want to offset each color by 30 degrees, and by doing that, that makes the color look the most vibrant, and it also avoids a very kind of destructive thing that can occur. And that is what's called moire. So what's funny is that when you have a pattern and you introduce it to another pattern, depending on how those angles interact with each other, it can create like a tertiary pattern. So what a moire is, it's an undesirable pattern caused by how the halftone colors interact when printed on top of each other. So if you're trying to reproduce a color image and your angles are not correct, you're going to start getting this like wire pattern that goes through it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do on press to fix it. And so you'd have to go remake your plates. So it's something to understand that we want to avoid. So by offsetting our colors that print on top of each other by 30 degrees, it eliminates this moire pattern that occurs. Now this is something that I'm bringing up because there is a big difference in a couple on how we print halftones. So there's two different ways. There's what's called AM screening or FM screening. So AM is the dots are very evenly spaced on a grid, and it's a very kind of clean pattern that we wind up seeing. The spacing of the dots stays the exact same. What changes is the size of those dots. Now, on the flip side of things, there's another form of screening called FM screening. Sometimes this is called stochastic screening, and the difference in it is that the dots are randomly spaced. All of the dots are the exact same size, so basically those dots, whether the dots are 90% or 10%, the dots are the same size. It's just the spacing between them that is different. Now there's advantages to both of these, and both of these types of screenings can be used in flexography. But generally, most things are reproduced using AM screening when it comes to a conventional print process like flexography or offset printing or screen printing. some of those the more conventional forms of printing stick with this, but or even laser printers use digital laser printers will use this type of screening. But if you get into any kind of inkjet printing technology, the inkjet printing technology is just, it's different, and because of it, it uses this FM screening pattern. So if you look at something that is inkjet printed, it's always going to have this kind of patterning in it. So just something to understand. In this class, when we do get to halftones on our third project, we will be using AM or conventional style screening. There are even forms of screening that combine both of these types together to create like a hybrid screening, and that's used, and we're actually seeing a whole lot more of that being used today, because the thing is that stochastic screening actually handles highlight areas better than conventional ones do. So these dots, it's kind of like this. It's like if since all the dots are the same size, if you can hold that size dot, well then you can print the whole thing, all the way to this, to 1%. The problem with the conventional or AM screening is that those dots continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller all the way down to 1%. And sometimes those very, very, very teeny tiny dots, they just don't hold very well. And that's something also that we'll look at and address in our third project. So the thing about these darn dots is that they kind of have a mind of their own. And, a lot of times halftones print darker or larger than they're intended. And this is something that we can predict. I mean, it's something that happens in all forms of print, and it's something that happens that we're going to expect it. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm not going to go into all of the reasons at this point that dot gain occurs. But what I want you to understand is that that there is, like, these dots, they have to be managed. They have to be controlled. Otherwise they're not going to do what is expected. It's because something looks good on screen doesn't mean that it's going to directly come out and look well. I mean, I think we can all we've all experienced how we've looked at an image on our monitors. We've gone and printed it out on our inkjet printers. It comes out and the inkjet printer looks darker. I think everybody's, I'm sure, has experienced that. And a big part of that is dot gain. There's another element to it too that I'll talk about later. But dot gain is a very real thing that we need to understand and be able to address whenever we're moving through our prepress workflow. So, like I said, dot gain, it happens in all forms of print. Doesn't matter if it's a digital print of some sort, flexo, whatever. Dot gain's going to happen. It is a part of the process. It's, like I said, it's unavoidable. The good thing is that it's predictable. If it does it one time, most likely using the same set of variables, it's going to do that exact same thing every single time. So it's predictable, which is good. And if it's predictable, we can compensate for that sort of thing. And that's also a large job of the prepress artist, is being able to compensate for dot gain. And what we can do is we can create things called a dot gain curve. Sometimes dot gain curves are referred to as transfer curves. And essentially what these compensations do is that if we know that the dots are going to print darker and larger, well, what we do is we just make them smaller. We make those dots smaller so they grow and they darken to what they're supposed to look like. And again, a very big role for the prepress artist is understanding this and being able to manipulate it. So, and one of the ways that we gain insight on how a device reproduces tones is through a process called fingerprinting. This is essentially running a test on a press or a printer of any type and kind of examining how the dot gain is occurring. So essentially what it is we create a known test image, and just as an example, we print it out, and we know that this should be a 50% area of coverage. So we print it out. Usually we use a device called a densitometer. We measure that, and we find out from this test how much dot gain we're getting. So let's just say hypothetically, that 50% dot is actually printing 65. So it gained 15%. Well, what a dot gain curve will do is that if we know it's going to grow 15%, well, we just shrink it by 15%. So it grows to what it needs to be. And this is how we get our colors and our tones to reproduce more accurately. So that kind of helps us move into the idea of color reproduction as it pertains to the flexographic printing process. So if we're going to reproduce something that is full color, we're going to use something called process color printing. And process color printing it's using four very particular type of inks that are transparent. We use the colors cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And from these four colors laying on top of each other, they blend the light so that it creates the color that we want to see. So this is commonly referred to as CMYK printing. If you have a desktop printer at home, or if you've ever used one, well, you've used process color, because virtually all digital printing processes use a combination of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black to reproduce color. So they work very well for full color photo. It works very well for full color photographs. The thing to kind of keep in mind with process color is that it's limited. Like I said, in Photoshop, a color pixel can be one of 16.7 million different colors. Well, CMYK can't reproduce all of those colors. It just can't. What it reproduces is just a smaller range of color. It might get close, but if you are trying to reproduce extremely specific colors, like corporate colors, think about Coke red. Think about how important that particular red is to that company. Coke would never use process color to reproduce that red. Or if they did, man, it's going to be a really, really stringent process to do it so that color is reproduced perfectly. Marketing departments are very, very particular about their corporate colors. So when we're trying to do that, CMYK usually is not a great choice for that sort of situation. So when we talk about, those sorts of situations where we need highly accurate colors, we use what's called spot color. So spot color is an ink that is mixed to reproduce a very particular color. It's great, and it works extremely well for corporate colors. And the other nice thing about it is that it provides a really nice, clean, even coverage of color over large areas. So if we look at, if we compare these two images right here, essentially if we just want a blue and a brown color that's being printed, well, it's a whole lot easier to reproduce those colors by just using spot color. If we wind up using CMYK, for one, it just doesn't look, smooth and clean. Now, or it doesn't look as smooth and clean. Another way to think about it is that this can reduce the number of colors that need to be printed. So wouldn't it be a whole lot easier to just set up 2 colors instead of 4 on a press? It's going to save a lot of time. It's going to save money. And then the end product is going to look more accurate, and it's going to be cheaper. So that's something that is very, very commonly done in flexography, and actually in all forms of conventional printing. We don't really see that so much in digital printing, and that's one of the the downsides to digital printing is that we can't incorporate spot colors into most digital printing scenarios. So another thing to keep in mind too is that spot colors cannot be used to reproduce a color photograph. So if you have a layout, and let's just say in that layout there's just if you think about like a package that might be for a candy bar or something like that. If most of the package is solid colors, but there's one little photograph of the candy itself, it's going to be hard to duplicate that using the spot colors. So you'd have to use some spot colors to do the background and all that, and then add in CMYK for just that small area of the print. And that's something we see very commonly in flexography, because we have this balance of trying to reproduce images, but we also have this need to address corporate colors and also large areas of coverage. Spot colors are going to do that a whole lot better. So so that's why we see it so much in flexography and conventional style printing. All right, so let's kind of jump into some other areas that a prepress artist might address. And these are just some common things and vocabulary that we should be accustomed to in printing in general. So one of these things is called bleed. So bleed is when you extend your color or artwork beyond where it is going to cut. So if we have a template and that template is going to cut out, let's just say, a particular square, if we want this red to extend all the way to the edge of that cut, what we're going to do is we just extend the red just slightly beyond where it's going to cut. And what this winds up doing is that some of that red is going to be trimmed away. Some of it's going to be trimmed away, but the final product will have that red going all the way to the edge. The thing is that when we go to press and we print something, there's a tiny bit of shifting that occurs throughout the run. And if the red just lined up exactly with the cut, well, we might get it lined up and it looked good, but after a little bit of time or after a handful of repeats, it will shift. I mean, we're talking about a very small amount, and that small amount will introduce a sliver of white that would show up right here. So the easy thing to do to compensate for this so that this is not ever an issue is just extend it a little bit beyond, and if it shifts a little bit, well, no color of the substrate is going to pop up around the edges of the cut. So it's a very easy way to compensate for any kind of shift between the print and then how it's trimmed down. Another common compensation and this is something that we'll be addressing in our second project, is the idea of trapping. So just like with a bleed, when we're trying to line up to the die, there's a tiny bit of shifting that occurs. Well, the same thing happens when we go from one color to the next. So in this case, what we do is we take the lighter of the two colors and we spread it just a little bit. We spread it, and by spreading it, the edges of where the two colors meet will overlap just slightly. And what that winds up doing is it just adds that compensation for the tiny bit of shifting that occurs in the printing process. And this is something that is done in all the conventional forms, as well as in a lot of digital printing as well. And what this winds up doing is it hides any imperfections. Now, this particular example that I have right here, we show that if we don't have trap and there's a little bit of shifting that occurs, well, again, that little white area is going to pop up, and we want to avoid that. Well, so here we see that the two colors are overlapping. Now, this is a visual, okay? Just so you know, because what we see here is like, well, there's this third color that appears. That's not really what trapping is for, and really, if we're using good quality inks, the darker color is going to overlap the lighter color, and we're not going to see this third color kind of pop up from the two blending together. A lot of times this is definitely used in spot colors quite a bit, and also can be used in process as well, but mainly for spot. But the thing is that when we use spot color inks, they're usually very opaque, and whenever they do overlap, whatever color is on top, which is going to be the darker one, will will win out and completely overprint and cover up that lighter color that's beneath it. So this is something that takes a lot of practice and education in order to be able to do it really well. But we're going to start working on this soon in the class, this particular trait. Now, something that we've already addressed in our first project is the idea of distortion. So what distortion is it's a compensation for plate stretch that occurs when the plate is mounted on a cylinder. So if we have a flat plate, and we take that flat plate, and then we take it and we go and wrap it around a cylinder, when we do, that face is going to stretch. Now the backing of it doesn't stretch, but because it's a raised image, when we wrap it around, that stretching does occur. And we have to do this, otherwise, for one, our plate's not going to fit around the cylinder, but also two, our artwork is going to be slightly stretched in the direction that it's going around the cylinder. So it's definitely something that we want to address. It's very easy to do, something that's very quick to do, but the thing to understand, it should be the very, very last adjustment that you do to any artwork before the plates are made. Another common prepress compensation is the idea of an underbase. So let's just say we're printing on a clear label. So if we print on a clear label and we go print our inks on top of that clear label, they're not going to, and we don't, if we just go print it directly onto it, the colors are not going to be very saturated. Whenever we put it onto a bottle, in this case a label, the contents of the bottle are going to kind of show through the inks, and it's going to disrupt the way that the artwork is intended to be viewed. So what we do is we print white underneath the artwork, and that gives it a base. That gives a base for the inks, the colors to lay on top of. When we do this, what occurs is that the colors that are printed on top of the white become much more saturated, much more opaque, and it blocks out the color of the bottle interacting with those colors that are being printed on top on the clear label material. The other nice thing about an underbase is that, well, it's white ink. So since it's white ink, it can be used as another color in that design. So when we look at this particular wine label, we can see that, we've got white for the type right here, but the thing is that white, even though that we only see that little bit of it, white is behind this entire image right here. So something that's very, very commonly done. It takes a skilled prepress artist to be able to do, and it dramatically improves the color reproduction of on the label. And really, the last term that concept that we'll talk about is color management. Now, I'm not going to go into what the ins and outs of color management is, but what you need to understand about color management is that it's the use of software, hardware, and methodology to create consistent and predictable color across all devices in a workflow. So the thing is like if you have artwork, well, that artwork might be going in a lot of different directions. Maybe you're a designer or working for a marketing department and you create artwork for the brand. Well, that artwork might be going to the internet. It might be going on labels. It might be going on to packages. It might be going on to in-house documents that are being, distributed. The thing is like all of those different, outputs they're going to have different ways of reproducing color. Even just sending artwork that I've worked on to another individual, within the workflow, just from going from my computer to another, the way I viewed the color on my screen might look very different when they open up that same exact file on their screen. So color management is a way to control how the color is reproduced from any other device. So every single device, regardless of the make and the model or what it is, it's gonna reproduce color in an individual way. Every device in itself is kind of like a snowflake. It's going to handle that color differently. And what color management is capable of doing is to compensate when it goes to a different device, so that regardless of how that snowflake of a device reproduces color, that when it goes out of that device, it looks the same as when it goes out of another, or when it's viewed on your monitor. So it's something that's actually very complicated. Well, I take it back. There's a lot of things that you need to understand about color management, but if you can kind of grasp the fundamentals of it, you can really, really set yourself apart from a lot of the other people working in the industry, because this is something that, in my personal opinion, is one of the most important concepts to understand, but I also feel like it's one of the least understood concepts in the process. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth on this, but just understand that this is a gigantic part of a prepress technician's role is understanding color management and being able to manipulate their workflow so that the color is consistent across multiple platforms. Super important. All right, so the thing that I just wanted to kind of wrap things up with here is that there's a lot of opportunity in this area, because prepress artists are problem solvers. They're people that predict issues that may happen. They're the type of people that receive a file, and if there's an issue with it, they're the ones that have to be able to identify what that problem is and then come up with a solution. And sometimes that solution is a very creative solution to make that artwork reproduce properly. Now the thing is you really have to have a very strong technical understanding of the print process. You need to have a very in-depth understanding of the applications like Photoshop, Illustrator, any of those. But you also need to understand, that there's how to use these applications for a particular workflow. Now the thing is but you also have to understand, what is the designer, what is the production artist, what are their goals with this artwork? And you've got to keep those goals and those ideas in mind, so that when you take their artwork and you manipulate it, that you're still satisfying all those goals. Like the goal of a prepress artist is to make it look exactly how the designer or the production artist, what their intention was. So, and that's not always so easy, because you might have to go and reproduce everything. You might have to switch things from process color to spot color. You may have to do a lot of different things and manipulations to it in order to make it work. But, you don't want the designer really to even know about that. You just want them to see the final product and be like, oh, that's exactly what I wanted it to look like. And that sort of thing, takes a very skilled technician. So employers struggle to find educated or experienced people to fill their positions, because, this is not the average Photoshop user. This is not the average Illustrator user. You think about it. I mean, these days, to find someone who knows how to play around in Photoshop, or someone that knows how to put together a logo in Illustrator, those people are a dime a dozen. I mean, It's just like there's tons and tons of people that know how to do that, but how many people know how to use Illustrator to take that artwork, to fix it, to manipulate it, and to make the color reproduce properly when it moves through that workflow? Like, how many people know how to do all that? Very, very few. And so that makes people that understand this, desirable, very desirable to companies. And it also can be very lucrative. I'll go ahead and say like there was a Prepress company here in Charlotte. They relocated to Greensboro, and when they relocated to Greensboro, they offered all of the employees that were here in Charlotte to relocate to Greensboro. Well, there was an individual that worked there that didn't want to relocate. They wanted to stay in the Charlotte area, and I get that. So when they applied for a teaching position here at CVCC, and on their resume, their previous, they put their previous salary on there, and it was $80,000. And I was thinking to myself, my goodness, what am I doing teaching? I should be doing Prepress. I shouldn't be teaching people how to do Prepress. I should be doing it. I'd be making a whole lot more money if I was doing that. The other thing too is like if you have a really strong understanding of something like color management, there's a lot of opportunity for consulting in that area. I met a gentleman who that was really their job, was to go into companies and set up color management for their employees and for their workflow. And he would charge $2,000 a day for him to come and do that. And a lot of times when he'd come and do it, he'd spend a week or more at a company doing it. And you think about that for just a second. If you go and you spend 5 days at a company, you can make 10 grand. The guy makes 10 grand. If he works 1 week, 1 week a month in a year, I mean, he makes 120 grand that year. So that sounds awfully good to me. I don't know about you. So something to imagine. Now, I just want to also clarify everything I just said. Those are people with experience. Don't expect $80,000 or $120,000 a year for an entry-level Prepress job. That's not really the case. That's something that's going to build from experience. But entry level, you could expect anywhere, around $20 to $25 an hour, which definitely leads to a really great start for an entry level person. So that's a little bit about Prepress and some of the things that you need to know. There's actually a lot more that you need to know, but that kind of lays the foundation of some of the basics. And we will be getting into more depth onto a lot of these topics as we move forward, and also as you move forward in more of the classes here at CVCC, you will learn more about some of those more advanced concepts like color management. All right, thank you, and have a great day.